He felt it the instant the head left the shoulders. Not triumph, not satisfaction, horror. The kind of horror that reaches through centuries of conditioning and genetic engineering and the slow rot of a demon's whispers and touches the thing underneath all of that. The thing that was still impossibly recognizably a person. The silver blade was wet with his best friend's blood, and Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children, stood on the black sands of Isstvan V, surrounded by the screaming death of the greatest betrayal in human history, and for one brief, terrible moment he was himself again. He knew what he had done. The demon in the blade knew it too, and it moved fast. It offered him something no one else could offer in that moment of raw grief. An exit, oblivion, a way to stop feeling the weight of what he had just become. And Fulgrim, in that single most human moment of his existence, said yes. That deal is the core of everything. That decision made in grief to trade consciousness for numbness is what separates Fulgrim from every other traitor Primarch. Angron was tortured into madness. Magnus was manipulated into catastrophe while trying to prevent one. Horus was shown visions of a future that may not even have been real. But Fulgrim stood there in full clarity, saw what he had done, understood what he was becoming, and chose to stop fighting it. He handed himself over. And that choice, that one authentic, terrible choice, is what makes his story the most disturbing of all. Today, 10,000 years later, Fulgrim is a four-armed serpentine demon prince whose scales catch the light of dying stars, and whose very presence rewrites the brains of those who look too long. He is considered one of the most dangerous entities in the galaxy. His legion has fractured into warbands that practice atrocities as art forms. He sits somewhere in the Eye of Terror or beyond, on a world that even other Chaos Space Marines can't find, indulging pleasures that have no name in any human language. And nobody talks about what he gave up to get there. This is that story, not the fall. Everyone covers the fall. This is the story of why the fall was inevitable from the first day, why Slaanesh didn't corrupt Fulgrim so much as complete him, why the one moment of genuine horror on Isstvan V was the last real thing that happened to a man who stopped existing centuries before he technically died. And it's the story of what 10,000 years of demonic existence does to someone who built their entire identity around being the best at everything. Because here's the question nobody asks. If you spend an eternity getting whatever you want, and you're literally the chosen champion of a god whose entire domain is desire fulfilled, when does perfection become a prison? Let's go back to the beginning. Before the sword, before Isstvan, before any of it, there is a world called Chemos that used to sit in the Ultima Segmentum deep in the Aquitaine sector, warmed by a binary star too dim to do the job properly. The result was a planet in perpetual twilight. The settlers who arrived during the dark age of technology had built it as a mining operation, extracting resources they traded to other worlds for food and necessities. When the age of strife cut those trade routes, Chemos began dying. By the time an infant Primarch's gestation pod screamed down out of the sky and crater-punched into Chemosian soil, the planet had spent generations in managed decline. Art was gone. Music was gone. Anything non-essential had been abandoned because survival required every watt of human energy. The fortress factories ran everything, the caretakers enforced everything, and children who were orphaned were put down rather than fed from reserves they couldn't justify. Fulgrim survived that policy only because the scout who found him couldn't bring himself to follow it. Something about the infant. And remember, this was a Primarch, already physically extraordinary even moments after landing, made the man beg the executives to spare the child. He raised Fulgrim as his own son. That origin matters more than it usually gets credit for. Fulgrim grew up on a world that had learned to see beauty as a luxury it couldn't afford. He grew up understanding that art and culture and refinement were things that existed in some other better place. A place Chemos had been briefly long ago and might be again if conditions allowed. And conditions did allow eventually because Fulgrim himself made them allow. By adolescence, he was doing the work of an adult. By adulthood, he was running the fortress factory Kallax. By the time the Emperor's ships broke through the dust cloud above his world, Fulgrim had transformed a dying planet into something approaching civilized by sheer force of will. He had dragged beauty back from the edge by himself. Think about what that does to a person. Think about what it teaches you at the deepest level about where value comes from. It teaches you that excellence is what you make it. That if you stop pushing, stop improving, stop striving towards some ideal, things collapse back into gray ugliness and slow death. It teaches you that perfection isn't a destination. It's a constant, exhausting act of maintenance against entropy. Fulgrim carried that lesson into everything he ever did. When the Emperor arrived and introduced him to his legion, 200 warriors, all that remained after a devastating accident had destroyed their gene seed stocks, Fulgrim didn't despair at their reduced state. He gave a speech that moved even his father. He told those 200 men that they were the Emperor's chosen, that imperfection was the only way to fail, that they would go out into the stars and demonstrate what humanity could be at its highest. The Emperor was moved enough to give the legion their name, the Emperor's children. He granted them the singular honor of bearing his own personal sigil, the Palatine Aquila, on their armor. No other legion in history received that distinction. Here is my first genuine interpretive position on Fulgrim, and I hold it firmly. That honor was the worst thing that could have happened to him. Not because it was undeserved, it wasn't, but because it bound Fulgrim's identity to a standard he couldn't control. The Emperor's children, the only legion allowed to wear the Emperor's own eagle. That title isn't a reward, it's a performance obligation with no clear endpoint. You can never fully achieve it. You can never point at something and say, "There, we are the Emperor's children, we have proven ourselves, we can rest." The goalpost moves forever. And for a man whose entire psychology was built around the need to be sufficient, to justify his existence, to make Chemos beautiful enough to deserve to survive, that moving goalpost was catnip for exactly the kind of obsession that Slaanesh feeds on. There's an additional layer that the lore touches on but rarely emphasizes. Fulgrim knew from the moment he met his legion that they had nearly not existed. The gene seed accident that reduced 200 battle brothers was a wound in the Legion's identity that never entirely healed. Every other legion had its full complement, its established traditions, its sense of continuous heritage. The Emperor's children had 200 survivors and a Primarch who had to rebuild everything from scratch. The insecurity that came from that near extinction, the haunting sense that they had once almost failed before they even started, never left. Fulgrim tried to turn it into fuel. He made the scarcity the motivation. We were nearly lost, therefore we have to be worthy of having survived. We have to justify the survival by being magnificent. This is psychologically understandable, but it's also a trap. Identity built on surviving a near catastrophe is identity permanently tethered to that catastrophe. You never stop proving you deserve to be here. You never reach the point where you've demonstrated enough. The standard keeps rising because the underlying anxiety never resolves. The corruption didn't start on Laeran. It started the day Fulgrim decided that perfection wasn't just a personal virtue but an identity, a self. The Emperor's children became legendary during the Great Crusade. That's not disputed. Under Fulgrim's command, alongside Horus's Luna Wolves for the first century of their reunification before they had the numbers to campaign independently, the Third Legion earned a reputation for precise, elegant, devastating warfare. They were flexible where the Luna Wolves were direct. They were subtle where Angron's World Eaters were savage. They fought with the kind of thoughtful craft that reflected their Primarch's belief that even war could be done beautifully if done right. Fulgrim formed his deepest friendships during this period. With Horus Lupercal, who was swift and intuitive where Fulgrim was considered and patient. The two men complemented each other perfectly, their legions fighting side by side and becoming bound by the kind of oath brotherhood that crossing decades of shared combat creates. The relationship with Horus had a quality of mutual appreciation that matters for understanding how Fulgrim eventually fell. Horus was the one person who could make Fulgrim feel seen at the level of command, who understood the specific demands of leading a legion, who could look at a campaign Fulgrim had run and recognize the choices behind the choices. When Horus praised the Emperor's children, it wasn't generic approval. It was genuine assessment from someone capable of judging. That mattered enormously to a man whose deepest anxiety was about whether he was actually sufficient. Which means Horus was also the most dangerous possible vector for corruption. When someone who truly sees you tells you that you've been undervalued, you believe it. When someone who understands your work tells you the work deserves more than it's gotten, the seed lands in fertile ground. And with Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hand's Primarch, whose relationship with Fulgrim was as different from the Horus friendship as could be imagined, and somehow even stronger for it, Ferrus Manus was everything Fulgrim was not. Where Fulgrim was beautiful, Ferrus was blunt-featured and scarred. Where Fulgrim valued refinement, Ferrus valued function. Where the Emperor's children pursued the aesthetic of perfection, the Iron Hands pursued its mechanical reality. They should have had nothing to say to each other. Instead, they made each other weapons. Fulgrim forged the power sword Fireblade as a gift to Ferrus. Ferrus made the Thunderhammer Forgebreaker as a gift to Fulgrim. Two craftsmen from opposite philosophies, each creating something in the style of the other, each learning from the other's excellence. That's not political alliance, that's genuine love between people who understand each other at a level most people never find. The friendships with Horus and Ferrus pull in opposite directions in the corruption narrative. Horus sees Fulgrim as an ally who should want more. Ferrus sees him as a friend who is going wrong. In the final accounting, Horus got what he wanted from Fulgrim and used it. Ferrus tried to stop what was happening and paid for it with everything. That's not a coincidence. The friendship that expected things of Fulgrim won him. The friendship that simply wanted him to be himself lost him. Because being himself, the genuine self underneath the performance of excellence, was exactly what Fulgrim couldn't tolerate by that point in the story. The Legion grew. New recruits came from Chemos and from Terra. Thousands of warriors were shaped by Fulgrim's vision of what an Astartes should be, physically magnificent, intellectually cultivated, precise in battle, and accomplished in the arts of peace. They fought alongside remembrancers, the artists and historians embedded with the expeditionary fleets to document the Great Crusade. They were genuinely interested in culture in a way that was unusual even among the Primarchs. The Emperor's Children's approach to the Great Crusade reflected Fulgrim's deepest beliefs. Other legions optimized for particular functions, the Space Wolves as shock assault troops, the Imperial Fists as siege masters, the Ultramarines as versatile conquerors. The Emperor's Children sought to excel at everything simultaneously. They were flexible tacticians who could adapt their style to any engagement. They were masters of coordinated assault and controlled withdrawal. They produced warriors who were also musicians, painters, sculptors, men who could hold a bolter to parade ground standards and then discuss the technical merits of pre-Unity Terran classical composers in the officers' mess. This dual identity was genuinely remarkable, and it was genuinely vulnerable. The pressure to perform excellence in every domain meant the Emperor's Children were always measuring themselves, always competing, not just against enemies, but against their own previous standards and against each other. A legion of approximately 20,000 warriors, each of whom was expected to embody perfection in all things, created an internal culture of relentless self-evaluation. Some warriors thrived in that environment. Others developed the particular brittleness that comes from tying your sense of worth to metrics that never quite credit the work you've done. Fulgrim encouraged this. He believed it produced better warriors, and he was right. The Emperor's Children's combat record during the Great Crusade is remarkable. Compliance campaign after compliance campaign conducted with speed and precision that other legions couldn't match without his legion's specific culture. But he also knew, or should have known, that the same psychology that drove excellence to those heights would break catastrophically if it found something that couldn't be achieved through effort alone. That cultural openness would become a vector. The Emperor's Children's 28th Expeditionary Fleet encountered a world designated 28-3 in the official records, better known as Laeran. The Laer were a serpentine xenospecies who had done something remarkable. They had genetically engineered themselves at birth into castes perfectly adapted for their societal roles. Workers were built for labor. Soldiers were built for war. Artists were built for art. Their entire civilization operated at a level of refined efficiency that made imperial administrators quietly wonder if they shouldn't be incorporated as a protectorate rather than exterminated. Fulgrim found the idea offensive. Only humanity was perfect. The Laer's apparent excellence was just alien mimicry of something that belonged to mankind alone. He ordered the attack. He promised to have Laeran conquered in a month. The Council of Terra had predicted the campaign would take solar decades. He kept his promise. The Cleansing of Laeran was a masterpiece of rapid, overwhelming assault. Every island fortress stripped of its defenders in 30 days of brutal, continuous combat. The Emperor's children paid a real cost in casualties, but they did it. Fulgrim proved once again that the Emperor's children could accomplish the impossible because they were the Emperor's children, and what else would you expect from the Emperor's children? It's worth pausing here to think about what the Laer actually were. What we know now that the 28th Expeditionary Fleet did not know then is that the Laer had wholly given themselves over to the worship of Slaanesh. Their society, their genetic castes, their art, and their war, all of it was in the service of the Prince of Pleasure. That core floating island at the center of their world wasn't just a command hub. It was a temple. And at its center was an artifact so saturated with Slaanesh's attention that it had become genuinely supernatural. A sword. Beautiful, curved, single-edged silver with a crude amethyst set in the pommel. And inside it the captured soul essence of a greater demon of Slaanesh. A being that had been waiting in there for an indeterminate amount of time. Patient the way only immortal predators can be patient, waiting for exactly the right host. Fulgrim picked it up and took it with him as a trophy. He didn't understand what it was. The Imperium at this point officially held to the imperial truth, which maintained that the supernatural didn't exist, that the warp was just a medium for travel and communication. That gods and demons were primitive superstitions. The idea that a sword could be a prison for a divine predator was simply outside Fulgrim's conceptual framework. The sword was beautiful, single-edged, silver, curved with the elegant precision that the Laer brought to everything they designed. The amethyst in the pommel caught light in ways that seemed slightly wrong. The blade had a quality of aliveness to it. When you held it, the grip felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with ambient temperature. These were things people noticed and rationalized. Beautiful workmanship, exquisite materials, a trophy worthy of a Primarch. So he put it on and started carrying it everywhere. This is the part everyone knows, the blade of the Laer whispered to Fulgrim, gently at first, insinuatingly, feeding his existing anxieties rather than creating new ones. You're extraordinary, but are you truly perfect yet? Look at your legion. Some of them are holding back. They could be so much more. The Emperor doesn't appreciate what you've built here. Has he thanked you lately? Has he acknowledged what you've sacrificed? These weren't new thoughts. That's the crucial thing. Fulgrim had always worried about adequacy, his legion's adequacy, his own, whether their pursuit of perfection was moving fast enough, far enough. The demon didn't plant these anxieties, it just found the ones that were already there and watered them. The early signs of corruption were things that could be excused individually. Fulgrim became more impatient in councils, more dismissive of perspectives that questioned his assessments. The remembrancers embedded with the fleet, the artists and composers and sculptors who had always been welcomed by the Emperor's children's cultural sensibility, began producing stranger work, more intense, more visceral, fixated on sensation over meaning, on rawness over craft. The composer Bekwa Kinska, who had been working on what she called a masterpiece for months, was producing music that shouldn't have been possible on instruments that hadn't been modified. Her symphony, eventually performed for the Legion aboard the Pride of the Emperor in what became known as the Maraviglia, drew on harmonic frequencies that bypassed rational processing and went straight to something older. The audience's responses were increasingly involuntary. Demonettes manifested during the performance. The Maraviglia was what it sounds like, part concert, part mass possession, part the birth of what would become the Noise Marines. Warriors who had been exposed to those frequencies during the performance found that the sensation of battle had changed. Pain and pleasure had been rewired, one experience through the other. Fabius Bile's simultaneous neurological experiments on the Legion's warriors had modified their nervous system so that suffering produced stimulation rather than agony. That modification was initially framed as a combat advantage. Marines who don't feel pain fight longer. There's military logic in that of a kind. But the intent behind it, the joy Bile took in the modification, the way the modified warriors began seeking out situations that produced more intense sensation rather than efficiently completing their objectives. That wasn't military logic. That was the Legion's perfectionism starting to curdle into something else. The changes in the Emperor's children were gradual enough that people could rationalize each step. Fabius Bile, already a gifted but ethically flexible apothecary, began running experiments on the Laer's biology, finding new ways to enhance the Legion's warriors. The remembrancers embedded with the fleet began producing stranger and stranger art, their work growing more intense, more visceral, more fixated on sensation over meaning. The concerts and artistic performances aboard the flagship Pride of the Emperor became more elaborate, the music louder, the themes darker. Fulgrim himself became more volatile. His famous patience cracked when challenged. He began talking to a portrait of himself, a disturbing, distorted portrait painted by the remembrancer Serena d'Angelis, whose own descent into something wrong was tracking Fulgrim's almost perfectly. He murdered Lord Commander Vespasian, one of his own most trusted officers, when Vespasian confronted him about the corruption spreading through the Legion. Stabbed him in the neck, told himself it was necessary. He killed the sculptor Ostian Delafour after the man said something that Fulgrim interpreted as a slight against his artistic vision. Delafour had argued that the beauty of art comes from passion, not perfection, that the soul of a work matters more than its technical execution. Fulgrim couldn't bear that. Couldn't accept it. The idea that imperfection could be beautiful struck at something fundamental in him. When Eldrad Ulthran, the Eldari Farseer from Craftworld Ulthwi, tried to warn Fulgrim on the maiden world of Tarsus that Horus was being corrupted and was heading toward catastrophe, Fulgrim reacted with rage. Not just because the demon in the blade encouraged that rage, but because Fulgrim's loyalty to Horus was one of the things he was most proud of. His friendship with the War Master was part of his identity. Accusing Horus of corruption was accusing Fulgrim of bad judgment, and Fulgrim's judgment was not supposed to be wrong. He ordered the maiden worlds the expedition had discovered, beautiful, untouched worlds maintained by the Eldari, to be virus-bombed in his fury. Billions died because a Farseer bruised Fulgrim's ego. Horus Lupercal himself completed what the demons started. When Fulgrim met with the War Master at Horus's own flagship, Horus used everything he knew about his old friend to make the final argument. He told Fulgrim that the Emperor didn't appreciate either of them, that the ultimate expression of human perfection wasn't service to a father who kept setting expectations no one could meet. It was transcendence, becoming something beyond the constraints of the Imperium. Chaos offered not corruption, but elevation. Fulgrim believed it. The daemon had spent months making sure he would. Before the first blood was spilled at Isstvan, Fulgrim was sent on a specific mission. Horus needed to know whether Ferrus Manus could be turned. Fulgrim, who knew Ferrus better than any living being, was the only one who could answer that question. He met with his brother on Ferrus's flagship, the Fist of Iron, and made the argument. Come with us. Join the rebellion. The Emperor has failed to appreciate what his sons have built. Humanity can reach something greater. The Chaos Gods offer power and freedom in exchange for loyalty. Not all that different from what the Emperor asks. Ferrus's response, according to every account of the meeting, was swift and furious. He told Fulgrim that he had been corrupted, that he had lost his mind to the whispers he'd warned him about. He told Fulgrim that what he was describing wasn't liberation, it was degradation. He told him to come back to the Emperor now, before it was too late. The meeting ended in violence. They didn't kill each other that day, but they parted as enemies. What Fulgrim couldn't know in that moment, what none of the traitors could know, because Horus's plan was laid in layers that even his most trusted allies didn't fully see, was that the path he'd committed to would eventually require him to use the people who trusted him as raw material. The Mogatar stone, which he would later give to Perturabo as what appeared to be a gift of solidarity and brotherhood, a gesture of traitor bond between two Primarchs who had chosen the same side, was actually a device for stealing life force, a mechanism for siphoning the essence of whoever wore or carried it and channeling that stolen energy toward Fulgrim's ascension. He gave it to his brother as a present, while planning to kill him with it. The detail that Fulgrim lied to Perturabo about the angel Exterminatus, that the entire expedition to the crone world of Idris was staged specifically to get Perturabo in position for the ritual, reveals something about where Fulgrim's corruption had taken him by that point in the Heresy. He had moved past the demon's whispers, past Horus's persuasion, past any external corrupting influence. He was making these choices himself, fully, with the full weight of a Primarch's intelligence and tactical planning behind them. The Mogatar stone was his scheme. The expedition was his plan. He selected Perturabo because Perturabo was powerful enough to fuel the ritual, and because Perturabo, by that point deeply resentful and isolated, having massacred his own homeworld and feeling used by Horus, would accept the invitation of a parent brotherhood. It's brilliant in the specific way that evil plans can be brilliant when they're built on genuine understanding of the target's psychology. Fulgrim knew what Perturabo needed to hear. He said it. And then he tried to hollow him out. The fact that Perturabo survived, that he found the strength to smash Fulgrim's mortal body with Forgebreaker even while being drained, that the unexpected arrival of loyalist survivors forced the ascension to complete under less controlled conditions than Fulgrim had intended. All of this meant the plan partially failed. But Fulgrim still became what he was reaching for. The mortal body was destroyed, the demon prince emerged. The partial failure in execution didn't change the destination. Every account of this meeting emphasizes that Fulgrim was genuinely shocked by Ferrus's reaction. He had expected resistance, yes. He had perhaps expected that he'd fail to convince his brother. But I think Fulgrim genuinely believed Ferrus might see the truth in what he was proposing. Because if Ferrus, brilliant, principled, unmovable Ferrus, could be convinced, then it meant Fulgrim was right, and Fulgrim needed to be right. The failure to turn Ferrus is more significant than its military implications. By this point in the corruption, Fulgrim had an entire internal architecture of justifications for every choice he'd made. The demon's whispers had been reinforced by Horus's persuasion, by Lorgar's theology, by the slow rewiring of the Legion's culture over months of accumulated excess. Everything pointed in the same direction. What he was doing was correct, was necessary, was the next step in humanity's ascent. Ferrus was the only person left in his life who knew him well enough to say no and have it mean something. And Ferrus said no. You can read that failure in multiple ways. The most obvious, Fulgrim was too far gone for even Ferrus's warning to reach him. The demon and the months of corruption had built walls around the part of Fulgrim that could respond to that kind of honesty. But I'd argue there's a harder reading that fits the evidence better. Fulgrim heard Ferrus, understood exactly what Ferrus was saying, recognized the love and the alarm behind it, and chose to go forward anyway. The pain of that meeting, the fact that his closest friend had seen him clearly and rejected what he'd become, wasn't suppressed by the corruption, it was weaponized by it. The demon turned Ferrus's clarity into evidence that Fulgrim had outgrown the old relationship, had transcended the kind of friendship that requires accountability. The fact that the lore records Fulgrim is shocked suggests his corruption hadn't entirely severed his ability to be surprised by human response. He hadn't become so alien that he couldn't model how Ferrus might react. He'd just decided the model was wrong. He was wrong about his model. The fact that the lore records Ferrus is furious suggests something different about the Iron Hand's Primarch, that he saw the corruption immediately and clearly, that he felt the full horror of what was being proposed, and that his love for Fulgrim expressed itself as anger because that was the only language available to him in that moment. Ferrus Manus didn't do sentiment easily, he did conviction. What he was telling Fulgrim with everything he had was, come back. Fulgrim didn't come back. The fact that Ferrus was then sent to Isstvan V, to the drop site massacre that Horus had orchestrated, with no way of knowing it was a trap. That tragedy is inseparable from this meeting. Ferrus Manus died at Isstvan V. He died because he went to fight traitors he thought he could defeat through force, because his Primarch nature gave him supreme confidence in his ability to win battles even against overwhelming odds. He died because Horus knew him well enough to design a trap for exactly that confidence, and Fulgrim's hands were on the blade that ended him. The fact that Ferrus's head was then presented to Horus as a trophy, the ultimate humiliation of a man who had been defined by his dignity and his integrity, is something the lore records Fulgrim as participating in. Whether he felt anything in that moment, whether some fragment of grief broke through the demon's control, the records don't say clearly. What they say is that he carried Fireblade, the sword Ferrus made for him. Whatever the interpretation, trophy, guilt, genuine commemoration, he couldn't leave it. That inability to let go might be the most human thing about him. 10,000 years later, still there. Before Isstvan V and the drop site massacre, there was Isstvan III. Horus's plan was methodical and cold. He needed to purge any remaining loyalists from the 4 traitor legions before the rebellion went fully public. To do that, he used the compliance campaign of the Isstvan system as cover. He sent every space marine of uncertain loyalty as the first wave down to the planetary capital, the Coral City. Once they were on the surface, he ordered the virus bombing, Life-Eater virus, the kind that consumed all organic matter with catastrophic efficiency. Imperial records, which conflict on the specific figure, estimate the death toll at somewhere between 8 and 12 billion people on Isstvan III. The carnage so total that the psychic resonance of that many deaths was reportedly felt across dozens of light years. Fulgrim wasn't there for this particular atrocity. Horus had dispatched him to make his approach to Ferrus Manus at the same time. But the Emperor's children at Isstvan III were commanded by Lord Commander Eidolon, and they participated fully. The viral bombardment was followed by fire from orbit. The loyalist space marines who survived by sheltering underground were then hunted through the ruins for months. A handful of Emperor's children among those loyalists fought with extraordinary courage under Captain Saul Tarvitz, who had risked everything to warn his brothers on the surface. Captain Solomon Demeter died in that fight. Tarvitz himself survived long enough to understand the full scope of what had happened. That Fulgrim, his Primarch, had chosen this. On Isstvan V, the drop site massacre used different mechanics. 3 loyalist legions, the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard, were lured in with the promise that they were joining traitor hunting operation already underway. Instead, 4 additional traitor legions who had been hidden on the far side of the landing zone turned on them the moment they committed to the assault. It was a slaughter dressed as a battle. Fulgrim was there for that one, and in the chaos of Isstvan V, amid tens of thousands of space marines killing each other in a darkness that would echo through the next 10,000 years, Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim met for the last time. The details of their duel are part of Horus Heresy legend. They fought with the weapons each had made for the other, Fulgrim wielding Forgebreaker, the massive thunderhammer Ferrus had crafted. Ferrus wielding Fireblade, the sword Fulgrim had made. Both weapons were destroyed in the exchange. Then Fulgrim took up the blade of the Laer. The moment the records all agree on, at the end of the duel with Ferrus beaten and at Fulgrim's mercy, Fulgrim couldn't do it. The man underneath the corruption, however buried, couldn't kill his best friend. He hesitated. The demon did not hesitate. It seized control. The silver blade rose and fell. And Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, Lord of Medusa, died at the hands of the person who had loved him best in the galaxy. What happened next is where Fulgrim's story diverges from every other traitor Primarch. The demon released its hold, and for a brief window of time, no one knows how long, minutes perhaps, Fulgrim was himself again. He stood there looking at what had been done. He felt the grief and the horror of it, unmediated by whispers or conditioning. The records indicate he was aghast, that he experienced something approaching genuine remorse, that the real Fulgrim, the one who had wept with Ferrus over shared victories and laughed at his blunt humor and counted him as the most irreplaceable person in his life, was still in there. And then he made his choice. He accepted the demon's offer. He allowed it back in, fully, permanently, in exchange for not having to feel that anymore. Not just the grief about Ferrus, all of it, the doubt, the fear of inadequacy, the constant grinding anxiety about whether he and his legion were truly sufficient. He traded his consciousness for peace from himself. The demon took his body and wore it. Fulgrim was relegated to a corner of his own mind, watching through his own eyes, unable to stop what his hands were doing. He would spend months there, watching, unable to act. Here is where I have to take a firm interpretive stand, because the lore is deliberately ambiguous, and I think that ambiguity obscures something important. Fulgrim's fall is often discussed in terms of how much agency he had. Was he a victim of the blade of the Laer? An innocent man manipulated by a predator he didn't know was there? Or was he complicit, choosing corruption at every step? The fandom debates this endlessly. The honest answer is that both framings missed the point. The demon's whispers worked on Fulgrim precisely because they were whispering things he was already capable of thinking. Every step of his corruption, the impatience, the volatility, the murders, the virus bombing of maiden worlds, the final agreement with Horus, had to pass through Fulgrim's own decision-making apparatus. The demon could nudge. It could amplify, but it couldn't make him do something that some part of him wasn't willing to do. The real question isn't whether the demon corrupted him. It's why Fulgrim was corruptible in the specific way he was. And the answer goes back to Chemos, back to a world where art was abandoned as an unaffordable luxury. Back to a child who had beauty stripped from his environment before he was old enough to know what beauty was, and who spent the rest of his existence trying to rebuild it. The pursuit of perfection was never just a virtue for Fulgrim. It was a way of managing an existential anxiety he never examined and never resolved. A wall built against the fear of inadequacy. Slaanesh didn't knock that wall down. Slaanesh walked through the door that was already in it. Fulgrim's guilt, then, is real but complicated. He was manipulated by something that understood him better than he understood himself. But he was manipulated via tendencies that were genuinely his, impulses he had never chosen to examine or challenge. The demon found the cracks because the cracks were there. I am not saying he deserved what happened. I am saying that the version of Fulgrim who eventually handed himself over to a greater demon wasn't a victim of external evil so much as the end point of an internal trajectory he never redirected. Which makes it tragedy in the Greek sense, not accident, not pure malice from outside. The mechanism of his destruction was built into his character from the beginning. For months after Isstvan V, Fulgrim was a passenger in his own body. The greater demon of Slaanesh, wearing his face, commanded the Emperor's children, participated in the war, and spent its time exploring the limits of what a Primarch's body could experience. The Emperor's children, who should have noticed, mostly didn't. Only Lucius the Eternal, who had the unusual sensitivity that came from being deeply, specifically attuned to Fulgrim's particular brand of excellence, seemed to sense something was wrong. He said nothing. What happened during this possession, what the demon learned, what it changed in the body's neural architecture, what pleasures it catalogued, is largely unrecorded. The lore doesn't give us the demon's perspective from inside. What we know is the result. When Fulgrim eventually fought his way back to control of his own body, when he used his imprisonment to study the warp and eventually turned the tables on the entity that had displaced him, he emerged changed. Not freed, changed. He had been watching from inside while the demon explored every sensation available to a being of nearly godlike physical capability. He had seen what was possible, and instead of being horrified by it, he was interested. That's the real inflection point. When Fulgrim regained control of himself, he chose to continue the path the daemon had walked for him, not because he had to, because he wanted to. The daemon, displaced, had its soul returned to the now inert blade of the Laer. Fulgrim gave the sword to Lucius, who had clearly demonstrated his devotion to the Slaaneshi path. The blade was essentially useless at that point. The demon was gone, it was just a very well-made sword. But the gesture said something. It said, "The demon's phase of my education is complete. Now I'll proceed under my own instruction." Fulgrim proceeded to his ascension through a mechanism that remains one of the more disturbing moments in Primarch history, because it involved consciously, deliberately harvesting the life force of another being to fuel a ritual. The events recorded in the novel Angel Exterminatus describe Fulgrim approaching Perturabo, the Iron Warrior's Primarch, with an offer. "Come with me into the Eye of Terror. There is a weapon there. Something called the Angel Exterminatus that could turn the war. Together we'll retrieve it and change everything." There was no such weapon. It was a pretext to get Perturabo to the crone world of Idris, site of an ancient Eldari ritual space, and a place saturated with the power of Slaanesh's birth. The gift Fulgrim had given Perturabo, the Mogatar stone, was not a gift. It was a mechanism for draining the Iron Warrior's Primarch's life force and feeding that energy into Fulgrim's ascension ritual. Fulgrim was literally trying to consume his own brother to become a god. Perturabo realized it. He gathered what strength he had left and charged, smashing Fulgrim's mortal body with the hammer Forgebreaker. The very weapon Ferrus Manus had made, the same weapon Fulgrim had wielded against Ferrus on Isstvan V. That convergence of symbolism has the ring of genuine cosmic irony. Loyalist survivors, Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guards still hunting the traitors across the system, interrupted the ritual at that moment. It didn't matter. Perturabo had destroyed the mortal body, but the ritual was already done enough. Fulgrim's soul, fully committed to Slaanesh, fully empowered by the stolen energy, was transmuted. The mortal form was discarded. Something new pulled itself together in the warp. When it remanifested, it was elegant and enormous and entirely alien, a serpentine lower body, long and powerful, scaled in iridescent colors that shift depending on the angle and the light. 4 arms, each capable of handling weapons with independent precision. A face that was still recognizably Fulgrim's, still beautiful, still silver-haired, still carrying that expression of aesthetic judgment that characterized the Primarch. But now also wrong in ways that only become clear when you look long enough and realize the proportions aren't quite right. The eyes hold something that doesn't fit behind a human face. He looked at the ruins of his ritual space. He looked at Perturabo, who was still standing through nothing but Iron Warrior's stubbornness. He told his brother they would meet again. And then, he was gone in a burst of warp energy. He was now a demon prince of Slaanesh. The period between his ascension and the Siege of Terra is instructive for what it reveals about how Fulgrim changed, or failed to change, after becoming a demon. He was supposed to be a decisive military asset during the end game of the Heresy. The assault on humanity's homeworld was the culmination of everything Horus had planned. The moment when all the sacrifice and all the atrocity and all the betrayal would supposedly pay off. Every traitor Primarch who could be there should have been there, throwing everything into the attack on the Emperor. Fulgrim was distracted, or disinterested, or both. Lorgar of the Word-Bearers, who had invested enormous effort in orchestrating the chaos of the Heresy and who understood better than almost anyone what the final assault required, reportedly found it almost impossible to get Fulgrim to commit fully. The lore describes something approaching an intervention, Lorgar essentially negotiating with Fulgrim to get him moving, managing the demon Primarch's capriciousness through a combination of appeal to vanity and strategic framing. Look at what's at stake. Look at what you'll be remembered for. Don't you want to be there at the moment humanity's course changes forever? Fulgrim could be motivated by that kind of appeal. Legacy, recognition, the historical record. These were things that still reached him. He agreed to participate. The Emperor's Children's assault on the Saturnine Gate is one of the Siege of Terra's most significant failures. Over 18,000 of the 3rd Legion died in that attack. A staggering loss even by the standards of a war that was consuming men at that rate across dozens of fronts. Rogel Dorn had prepared for it specifically. The Imperial Fist's Primarch had predicted with the tactical genius that defined him exactly which section of the palace walls the Emperor's children would target, and exactly how they would approach it. The attack failed, catastrophically, Thousands of perfectly trained warriors who had devoted their existence to the pursuit of excellence walked into a prepared killing ground and were systematically destroyed. Fulgrim was in that fight. He clashed with Dorn, Primarch against Primarch in the smoke and carnage of the palace walls. But it wasn't the kind of extended duel that the confrontations between great warriors often become in this lore. It was functional, interrupted, part of a larger battle that was going badly. Then Fulgrim got bored, mid-siege, possibly the most significant military engagement in human history, and Fulgrim decided he was done with it. He simply left. The lore is explicit that he departed the siege out of a kind of petulance. He was upstaged or unappreciated, or simply found the whole enterprise less interesting than whatever was waiting for him somewhere else. He vanished from the battle, and his legion was left to continue without him. This is, I would argue, the most revealing thing about what demonic ascension actually did to Fulgrim. Before the sword, before the corruption, Fulgrim was many things: the anxious, obsessive, capable of great cruelty and great kindness, fundamentally driven by a desire to be recognized as excellent. But he was consistent. He followed through. He led from the front. He built things that lasted. After Ascension, he became capricious in the specifically Slaanesh way, a being driven not by goals or loyalties or even desires in the sustained sense, but by novelty, by the next sensation. When something stopped being interesting, it was over. And for a being with unlimited access to the pleasures of the warp, most things stopped being interesting very quickly. Fulgrim pursued perfection his entire life. As a demon prince, he can achieve anything he could want. And that achievement, that fulfillment of the deepest desire, has left him with nothing to pursue. Because it turns out the pursuit was the point. Without the striving, there is only consumption. He had traded the most human thing about himself, the aspiration, the reaching towards something just beyond grasp, for the ability to have everything. When Horus died and the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror, the Emperor's children distinguished themselves in Chaos's retreat by going in the wrong direction, not fleeing towards safety, but turning to ravage the worlds they passed through. They left a trail of depopulated planets behind them. They raided other traitor legions for slaves when their own captives ran out, triggering a series of internal conflicts called the Legion Wars that made even the already fractious Chaos forces tear at each other. Fulgrim, meanwhile, had an errand. In 121 of the 31st millennium, approximately a century after the Heresy ended, the forces of the Great Scouring, the Loyalists' campaign to drive the traitor legions into the Eye, caught up with the Emperor's Children fleet. Robout Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, had assembled a force specifically to hunt Fulgrim, to hold him accountable for the atrocities of the Heresy in the only way available. He brought 6 successor chapters alongside his own Ultramarines to run the Emperor's Children to ground. They caught up in the Thessala system. Guilliman's fleet managed to breach the void shields on Fulgrim's flagship, the Pride of the Emperor, and Guilliman led a personal strike team to teleport aboard. His stated intention was to find Fulgrim and end him. His captains, Aeonid Thiel and First Captain Andros, had their doubts. They told him plainly that his desire to personally face Fulgrim looked a lot like pride rather than strategy. That his guilt about what had happened, the sense that he bore some responsibility for not stopping the heresy before it started, was pushing him toward a duel that pure tactical thinking would avoid. Guilliman acknowledged their concern and told them to wait outside while he went in alone. He entered the chamber called the Heliopolis and found Fulgrim waiting. Fulgrim tried, in his new serpentine form with 4 arms and that shifting quality of wrongness, to convince Guilliman to consider the path of chaos, to embrace what Slaanesh offered, to stop serving a father who was at this point barely alive, sustained only by the greatest sacrifice of human life in history. Guilliman told him no, and they fought. The duel was not a duel. Fulgrim had always been considered perhaps the greatest swordsman among the Primarchs, even before his ascension. And now he had supernatural strength, 4 independent weapons arms, demon speed, and 10,000 warp-enhanced combat instincts. Guilliman fought with the Emperor's own sword and everything the finest warrior mind in his legion could bring to bear. It wasn't close. Fulgrim overwhelmed him methodically, and when Guilliman called his men in, Fulgrim matched the threat by deploying the Emperor's children who had been waiting nearby. As their sons fought around them, Fulgrim's poisoned blade found the gap in Guilliman's gorget. A single slash. The blade carried a warp-tainted toxin that the finest ultramarine apothecaries couldn't counteract. They placed Guilliman in stasis. He would stay there for just under 10,000 years. Fulgrim left the Thessala system and disappeared from records for a long time. The Emperor's children claimed he had been gifted a hidden demon world somewhere in the Eye of Terror. A place of unlimited pleasure. A paradise tailored specifically to whatever Slaanesh understood Fulgrim's desires to be. He reportedly slept there for centuries at a stretch, or whatever the demon equivalent of sleep is. His legion, lacking consistent leadership, fragmented. The Emperor's children became less a legion than a loose collection of war bands, each pursuing its own particular strain of Slaaneshi excess. They became the noise marines, the sonic weapon specialists who turned war into a sensory assault. They became the flawless blades, the cacophony, the various formations that retained the Third Legion's obsession with refinement, but expressed it through increasingly elaborate cruelty. They were terrifying, and they were fractured, and they missed their Primarch in the way you miss someone whose absence is a constant reminder of how much has been lost. The 41st millennium's records of Fulgrim are fragmentary and weird, which is itself revealing. He appears, he does something dramatic, he vanishes. The appearances have the quality of a god who drops into his creation occasionally, rearranges things for his own amusement, and leaves. One of his known appearances in the longer run of post-heresy history was at the Sabist planet strike, where he killed an Iron Hands captain named Sind Grolvach. An Iron Hands captain. He specifically sought out and killed a senior warrior of the Legion that Ferrus Manus built. Whether this was grief processed as violence or pure malice or something more complicated that doesn't translate into human emotional categories, the records don't say. The Iron Hands kill one of their own brothers for being too emotional. Their culture was shaped by Ferrus, who prized cold function over warm sentiment. That Fulgrim keeps gravitating to their direction even thousands of years later suggests something more tangled than simple hatred. There is the famous occasion where Guilliman was finally revived from his 10,000-year stasis, brought back by the combined efforts of the Archmagos Belisarius Call and the Aeldari Inari. The moment Robut Guilliman drew a breath in the 41st millennium, Fulgrim felt it. Somehow, across the warp, through whatever supernatural connection exists between two beings whose history is that tangled, he knew. His response was to possess the Archconsul of Makraga, a relatively minor imperial official who happened to be present at Guilliman's first public appearance in 10 millennia. Through this body, Fulgrim made his way into Guilliman's triumph and addressed the returned Primarch. He told him that he would face many temptations to resist, that any self-satisfaction would be his doom. And then he left the Archconsul's body and vanished. It's petty. It's cruel. It's exactly the kind of thing that someone would do if they had infinite power and a very specific kind of grudge that never quite resolved. Not trying to kill Guilliman, not launching a campaign. Just showing up to gloat that the poison from Thessala had kept him on ice for all of recorded history. That Fulgrim had effectively benched one of the Imperium's most important assets for 10,000 years, and isn't that impressive? That's the thing about the 41st millennium Fulgrim that I think people don't examine closely enough. He's not driving toward anything. He's not building anything. His legion is fragmented, and he apparently doesn't care enough to reunify it consistently. He has the potential military power of a demon Primarch, a being that can casually swat away space marine companies and turn his mere presence into a psychic assault on everyone within range. And he deploys that power in service of showing off, settling old scores, experiencing the next novel thing. There is a recorded incident where Fulgrim appeared before a warband called the Perfecti Emperor's Children and personally led them in the conquest of an imperial world called Crucible. He declared on that world that he would launch a new crusade to liberate people from the Emperor's tyranny. He didn't follow through on the crusade. The declaration was theatrical. A performance, not a plan. This is the pattern: grand declarations and capricious exits. The Emperor's children who spend their lives searching for him get brief, brilliant appearances and then months or years of nothing. The codex describes this as the nature of a Slaaneshi Primarch. Impossible to predict, impossible to hold to any consistent agenda driven by whatever captures his interest in the moment. But I think there's something sadder underneath the capriciousness. Fulgrim can't commit to anything because nothing sustains his interest long enough to build toward. He has infinity and no way to fill it. He has the power to conquer worlds and no reason to rule them. He has the tactical genius of a great crusade Primarch and no objective that his genius could serve. He's a craftsman with all the finest tools in the galaxy and nothing he wants to make. The pursuit of perfection was supposed to be the answer. But the pursuit required something to pursue. Becoming the perfect demon prince of Slaanesh didn't give him an answer. It removed the question. There is a particular Chaos Space Marine psychological phenomenon worth noting here, the fundamental difference between what Slaanesh promises and what it delivers. It promises sensation, pleasure, experience, the fullest possible engagement with existence. What it actually delivers is tolerance. Every sensation becomes baseline. Every pleasure becomes the new normal that needs to be exceeded. The pursuit of greater and greater experience is itself what Slaanesh feeds on, not the arrival at satisfaction. If you actually achieved contentment, you'd be useless to the Prince of Pleasure. So Fulgrim, as Slaanesh's greatest prize among the traitor Primarchs, is structurally incapable of satisfaction. He is designed to keep reaching. The difference between him and the ordinary noise marine doing the same thing is scale and duration. He has 10,000 years of increasingly sophisticated desire and a supernatural body that can experience more than any mortal frame. And he is, in the ways that actually matter, as empty as he was the moment he handed himself over in grief on Isstvan V. There is an Isstvan III, there is an Isstvan V, there is Thessala, there is Kallax, his demon world, wherever it hides in the eye. There is Rylanor's confrontation. There is the Archconsul's body at Guilliman's triumph. There is the Crucible Declaration. There are 10,000 years of points on a map, and when you look at them as a whole, you see something that is not a trajectory, not a plan, just a being moving from bright thing to bright thing, unable to stop looking for the thing that will finally feel like enough. He still has Fireblade. He was drawn there by a sonic beacon. A signal had been broadcasting from deep beneath the surface, ancient and patient, designed specifically to reach Fulgrim wherever he was. When he arrived, he found Rylanor. Ancient Rylanor, venerable dreadnought, ancient of rites of the Emperor's children before the Heresy, had spent 10,000 years in a collapsed hangar deep underground, damaged in the final fighting of Isstvan III, kept active by a desire so pure and total that the dreadnought's power cells had somehow sustained it. A desire for one thing: to look Fulgrim in the eye and tell him what he had become and make him pay the price for it. Rylanor had built the beacon from Slaaneshi sonic weapons salvaged from fallen traitors over the centuries. He had been waiting in the dark under a dead world for 10,000 years alone, just so he could have this one confrontation. Fulgrim tore the dreadnought apart. Of course he did. A demon Primarch against even the most determined ancient warrior is not a fair contest. But before the end, Rylanor triggered the unexploded virus bomb he had found down there and kept carefully intact for exactly this purpose. He died in the blast, the detonation consuming the ancient hangar and the dead rock above it. One final act of defiance on a world that had already been dead for 10,000 years. Fulgrim survived because demon princes of Slaanesh don't die to virus bombs, but the lore records that Rylanor's refusal, his utter unwavering rejection of everything Fulgrim had become, his demonstration that 10,000 years of punishment hadn't broken his defiance, wounded Fulgrim in a way that physical damage couldn't. His pride, which is still there, 10,000 years later, buried under a daemon's pleasures and supernatural power, the thing that made Fulgrim who he was is still there. The anxiety about adequacy, the need to be recognized as excellent, the desperate requirement that those who matter acknowledge what he's accomplished. Rylanor, a single broken dreadnought in the dark, denied him that, refused to be impressed, died calling Fulgrim a monster, and it hurt. The fact that he wanted that, still wanted it after 10,000 years, is worth sitting with. A being who had truly transcended human need for recognition wouldn't bother offering anything to an enemy. He'd just destroy them and move on. But Fulgrim still reaches for the approval of people who knew him when. He still wants the people who were there at the beginning to see what he's become and be impressed. That Rylanor refused, that the last loyalist emperor's children dismissed Fulgrim's vision of perfection utterly before dying, wounded something that physical destruction couldn't reach. This could suggest that beneath the demon's indulgences, the original wound, the anxiety about whether he was ever truly sufficient, never healed at all. Here's the strangest element of Fulgrim's post-heresy story, and the one I find most philosophically interesting. It requires understanding what Fabius Bile has spent 10,000 years doing. Fabius Bile is the genetic architect of the Emperor's children, the apothecary who began modifying the Legion's warriors during the Great Crusade, who created the first noise marines, who has spent the millennia since the Heresy conducting increasingly elaborate experiments in human and post-human genetics. He is brilliant, ethically monstrous, and driven by a question he can't stop asking. What is the pinnacle of human biological potential? At some point before the 41st millennium, he achieved something he had been attempting for a long time. He successfully cloned a Primarch, his own genetic template, Fulgrim. What made this particular clone different from his previous failed attempts was that it worked completely. Not an approximation, not a flawed copy, but a genuine biological recreation of Fulgrim before the corruption. The clone had Fulgrim's genetic memory, which meant it remembered the Great Crusade, remembered Ferrus Manus, remembered Laeran and the sword, and Isstvan V. And it expressed genuine grief and remorse for those memories. It swore it would atone for what Fulgrim had done. Bile found himself unable to replicate himself. The clone's freedom from chaos taint was a mystery he couldn't solve. It just was somehow an aspect of the regeneration process. This clone was eventually traded to Trazyn the Infinite, the Necron overlord and notorious collector of unique biological specimens, in exchange for original Emperor's children genetic material that Bile wanted. The clean version of Fulgrim is now locked in stasis somewhere in Trazyn's gallery on the Necron world of Solomits, where he exists as a museum piece alongside whatever else the ancient Machine King has gathered from 10 millennia of collecting. I want to sit with the implications of this for a moment. There is a version of Fulgrim, biologically complete and mentally intact, who remembers everything and feels genuine remorse for it, who swore to atone, who is essentially the real Fulgrim freed from the corruption. And he's in a Necron's cabinet, unable to act, preserved as a curiosity, staring at the ceiling of an exhibition case while the demon version of himself roams the galaxy doing whatever feels interesting that week. Whatever the implications about identity and the soul, the clone represents something that the lore rarely acknowledges. that there was a Fulgrim who could have been good, who contained within him the capacity for genuine regret and genuine purpose. That person was real. He was in there on Isstvan V, and he surfaced briefly, and then he was buried under the choice to stop feeling. Whether the clone is that person or just a biological echo of him is a question the lore leaves unanswered. I find it the most compelling unanswered question in the entire Fulgrim narrative, because it suggests that the thing Slaanesh got wasn't Fulgrim's perfection. It was Fulgrim's potential, the version of him that could have been everything the Emperor hoped. And now that version sits in Trajan's gallery, in a box, exhibited alongside other curiosities from 10,000 years of the Necron overlord's compulsive collecting. A ghost of what was possible, preserved in perfect stasis, unable to act, unable to atone, unable to do anything except remember, and remember and remember with the genetic memory that the Emperor built into his Primarchs, all the way back to Chemos and the Forge Factory and the day the Emperor's ships broke through the dust cloud and a young man who had remade a dying world looked up at the sky and felt for the first time like he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. That Fulgrim never got corrupted, that Fulgrim never picked up the sword, that Fulgrim built something real and left it standing. He's in a Necron's museum. The real one is in the Eye of Terror, carrying a dead friend's sword, performing magnificence for an audience that will never be sufficient. Both are Fulgrim. That's the point. Both are real. The corruption didn't replace the original. It made a choice that the original was always capable of making, and then lived with the consequences until consequences stopped meaning anything. The clone's existence is the cruelest possible proof that Fulgrim could have been different, that the path was real, that the opportunity was there multiple times and was not taken. The opening of the Great Rift changed something in the calculations of the demon Primarchs. For Angron, it meant regular manifestation and direct assault. For Mortarion, it meant plague campaigns of unprecedented scale. For Magnus, it meant elaborate psychic manipulation from the planet of the sorcerers. For Fulgrim, the Great Rift seems to have made things more interesting again. The lore from the era Indomitus records him as more active than he's been in centuries. He appeared during the Arcs of Omen campaign. He's been cited leading his Emperor's children in attacks on Imperial worlds. Not the lazy possessions and brief appearances of the middle millennia, but genuine campaigns. There is even a mention of him approaching a war band called the Perfecti Emperor's Children, and personally leading them in the conquest of an imperial world called Crucible, where he declared he would launch a new crusade to liberate people from the Emperor's tyranny. The 10th edition codex for the Emperor's Children describes him as capricious, appearing when he wants to, disappearing when he's done, impossible to predict, increasingly inclined to materialize on a whim when something catches his interest. Emperor's Children warbands actively seek him out, not because he'll lead them with any consistency, but because being near him is its own experience. His very presence causes what the Codex describes as a visceral thrill in friends and foes alike. Being near a daemon Primarch of Slaanesh is itself a sensory event that people don't forget. He received a new model in 2025, the first time Games Workshop has produced a current-era Fulgrim miniature, four-armed serpentine covered in iridescent scales and elaborate ornamentation, carrying weapons that may be manifestations of his will or trophies from worthy opponents or both. The model is striking because it captures something the older representations didn't quite manage. The sense that Fulgrim is still in there, still specifically him, still carrying the aesthetic sensibility of the most refined Primarch in history. The form has changed beyond recognition, but the character hasn't entirely. It also wields what appears to be the sword Fireblade, the blade Fulgrim himself made for Ferrus Manus, the sword Ferrus died carrying. Whether this is the actual sword or a manifestation of Fulgrim's subconscious guilt is debated in the lore. The codex acknowledges the debate. My read is that it doesn't matter which explanation is true, because either way the sword's presence means the same thing. Fulgrim carries Ferrus everywhere he goes, even now. Even as a being who should have long since moved beyond anything as human as guilt. He cannot let go of what he destroyed. Even immortality hasn't provided the clean slate he paid such a catastrophic price for. I've been building toward this, and I want to state it plainly. Fulgrim's tragedy is not that he was corrupted. It's that he was completed. The pursuit of perfection, the Slaanesh doctrine, the demonic ascension. None of this gave Fulgrim something alien. It gave him what he was already reaching for, a self that was sufficient, a state where inadequacy was no longer possible, a form of existence where the anxiety that drove him could finally stop, because he had achieved something so far beyond ordinary excellence that the question of adequacy became meaningless. And it's empty. 10,000 years of evidence say it's empty because you can't build a self on achievement alone, and Fulgrim tried. The Emperor's Children Legion was the most beautiful thing he ever made. A legion in his own image, literally embodying his values, fighting in his style, pursuing his standards. And he corrupted it. He let the demon corrupt it, then he chose to continue the corruption even after he got himself back. What remained after Ascension was a being of enormous power with no particular direction. A god-touched entity who shows up to old battlefields to gloat and disappears for centuries when nothing catches his interest. A demon prince who can have anything and therefore wants nothing in a sustained way. Who is recognizable as Fulgrim primarily through the wound that hasn't healed, the fireblade he can't put down, the reflexive pride that Rylanor could still reach after 10,000 years. The occasional intrusions into Guilliman's timeline that have the quality of someone who just can't stop poking at a sore. His pursuit of perfection was supposed to free him from the fear of being insufficient. Instead, it gave him infinity and no way to fill it. The Fulgrim who died, the real mortal Fulgrim, the one who briefly resurfaced in horror after Ferrus died, knew how to want things, how to strive, how to be a person with a direction. The demon Primarch he became has only reflex and novelty where that used to be. Slaanesh won. The bargain was fulfilled. The Emperor's Children Primarch got exactly what he asked for. It's just that what he asked for was the wrong thing. To understand Fulgrim, you have to look at what his legion became, because a legion reflects its Primarch in ways that persist long after direct contact ends. The Emperor's children in the 41st millennium are among the most disturbing things in the galaxy, and not primarily because of their violence. Plenty of things in the 41st millennium are violent. They're disturbing because they've aestheticized horror, because they approach atrocity with the creative attention that Fulgrim once brought to warfare, because they treat every campaign as an artistic statement. Every world they attack is a canvas. Every population they terrorize is an audience. They are, in the most ghastly possible sense, exactly what Fulgrim always wanted them to be: excellent at what they do. The fact that what they do is monstrous doesn't change the technical quality of the execution. That's the sharpest insight the Emperor's children offer into what happens when you remove the ethical constraints from a pursuit of excellence. Excellence without ethics isn't just neutral. It becomes a force multiplier for whatever the unconstrained desire underneath is driving toward. And in this legion, that desire is pure sensation. Noise Marines, the most immediately recognizable component of the Emperor's children aesthetic. Warriors whose armor is studded with speakers and amplifiers, whose weapons generate sonic blasts of devastating power, who turn the sensory assault of battle into a form of music. They attack with strobing lights, disorienting harmonics, and the kind of psychological warfare that bypasses conventional cover and armor. They don't just want to kill you. They want the killing to sound a particular way. The first Noise Marines came from the Maraviglia, that catastrophic concert aboard the Pride of the Emperor where Bekwa Kinska's symphony called demons and rewired the surviving audience's nervous systems. The warriors who came out of that event had been changed at the neurological level. Pain and pleasure had been crossed. Sensation in any form produced stimulation. They became the cacophony, the Legion's sonic specialists, because that experience had opened something in them that couldn't be closed. This is Fulgrim, his love of music, his belief that excellence should be expressed aesthetically, his pursuit of perfection in all things, including war. The Noise Marines are the logical endpoint of the Emperor's children's founding virtues run through a Slaaneshi filter and left in the eye of terror for 10,000 years. The Legion's overall doctrine in the 41st millennium is best described as raiding with artistic intent. They don't conquer worlds for territory or resources in the conventional sense. They select targets for the specific experiences they offer. A shrine world with centuries of accumulated fervent prayer provides a particular quality of psychic resonance when desecrated. A world whose entire water supply can be poisoned with a nerve sensitivity toxin before the assault provides a particular quality of combat. Enemies who feel everything more intensely, who experience pain and fear and death with heightened acuity. They're looking for specific notes in a particular symphony, the cacophony, the flawless blades, the various war bands that still carry the Third Legion's colors. Each represents a different facet of what happens when Fulgrim's perfectionism operates without the restraint that his pre-corruption ethics provided. He believed before the sword that excellence had to be earned through genuine effort. After the sword, excellence became an entitlement, something to be taken rather than built, His sons took that lesson and ran with it for 10,000 years. Fabius Bile, who began his enhancement experiments as an apothecary trying to make the Emperor's children's warriors more perfect, has spent the millennia since the Heresy conducting experiments of increasingly dubious ethical character on human and post-human subjects. He calls himself the Clone Lord now. He's pursuing something he frames as the creation of the true perfected human, a new humanity beyond the Emperor's limitations, freed from the weaknesses that make ordinary people vulnerable. He's the Emperor's children's darkest philosophical tradition taken to its extreme. If Fulgrim believed that human potential had no ceiling and everything was worth sacrificing to reach it, Bile has no ceiling and nothing he won't sacrifice. Lucius the Eternal, whom Fulgrim gave the emptied blade of the Laer, became a champion of Slaanesh in his own right. Perhaps the most famous duelist in the galaxy, a figure who has etched every victory into his own skin and who carries a supernatural curse that resurrects him inside the body of anyone who killed him and felt even a moment of pride about it. He's Fulgrim's principle of competitive excellence turned into a supernatural kill loop. He exists to fight better and better opponents forever, because fighting is the only experience that still registers as meaningful to him. These are all, in their way, Fulgrim's children, his spiritual legacy. The Emperor's Children Codex describes them as driven by compulsive need for new thrills, as raiders who've made violence into performance art. They're what Fulgrim's philosophy becomes when it's freed of any anchor in genuine human feeling. There is a comparison that I think gets insufficiently made, and I want to make it here. Fulgrim and Angron are often treated as complementary figures in the traitor Primarch canon. The aesthete and the berserker, the refined and the savage, the general who considered each battle a work of art and the warrior who saw only blood. They represent opposite poles of what Primarchs could become under chaos. But I think the more revealing comparison is Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus. Two beings who genuinely loved each other, who brought out the best in each other, who made each other better, and who ended up on opposite sides of the greatest war in human history, not because they were fundamentally different, but because Fulgrim broke. Ferrus Manus had his own obsessions, his own perfectionism expressed through forgecraft rather than aesthetics, his own stubbornness, his own refusal to compromise. The Iron Hands are famously hard on themselves and each other, literally replacing flesh with iron in a misguided pursuit of inhuman capability. The Iron Hands' culture of self-improvement through the excision of weakness, biological weakness, emotional weakness, the weakness of mortality itself, has its own disturbing edge. The Gorgon's belief that flesh is weak and iron is better is a kind of perfectionism too. It just points in a different direction. If anything, Ferrus had the same tendency toward perfectionist excess as Fulgrim. He just didn't have a Slaaneshi daemon whispering to him through a cursed sword. And here's the uncomfortable implication of that. The line between Fulgrim and Ferrus may have been thinner than the lore presence. The same drive, the same need to transcend limitation. One found a demon blade on an alien world. One didn't. Circumstance. The point is, Ferrus Manus saw clearly what Fulgrim was becoming and chose differently. He refused. He said no. He was offered what Fulgrim was offered. the promise that there was something beyond the Emperor's constraints, something truer to his deepest nature. And he told Fulgrim to come back while there was still time. What would have happened if Fulgrim had listened? If at that meeting aboard the Fist of Iron he had heard Ferrus's alarm as love rather than condemnation? If he had let his best friend be the mirror he needed instead of the obstacle he couldn't afford? The answer that the lore implies, though it doesn't state it directly, is that Ferrus would have moved heaven and earth to help him. Ferrus Manus was not a man of emotional vocabulary, but he was a man of action and loyalty. If Fulgrim had said, "I think something is wrong with me, I need help, I can feel myself changing and I don't understand it," Ferrus would have responded to that. He was exactly the kind of friend who shows up in the crisis moment regardless of what it costs him. We'll never know. That version of history doesn't exist, but the question matters because it shows the choice was real. Fulgrim wasn't inevitably lost. He was lost through a series of choices that each could have gone differently. And the moment he could most clearly have reversed course was the moment he chose to go all the way instead. The sword Ferrus made for Fulgrim, the sword Fulgrim may now carry as his demon form, is the clearest image of what was lost. It's a gesture of love and craft from someone who understood Fulgrim well enough to make something in his style. Ferrus Manus, the man who valued function above aesthetics, worked to create something beautiful for his friend. He made the most beautiful thing he could because he knew Fulgrim would value it, and Fulgrim made the most functional thunder hammer he could because he knew Ferrus would value that. Each gave the other the thing they valued rather than the thing they preferred. That's what friendship at that level looks like. Not the merger of identical tastes, but the genuine effort to see through someone else's eyes and give them something real. That's what Fulgrim destroyed. That's what the daemon sword cost him. And then he took Fireblade, the sword he made for Ferrus that Ferrus died carrying, and kept it for 10,000 years. In the current era of the 41st millennium, Fulgrim occupies an unusual position among the traitor Primarchs. Angren manifests periodically and immediately begins killing everything. Mortarion runs extended plague campaigns with deliberate strategy. Magnus, when he acts at all, pursues layered psychic schemes. Perturabo, now confirmed as a demon prince as well per recent lore, prosecutes sieges across cosmic time scales. Fulgrim does whatever Fulgrim does. That formlessness is itself a kind of statement. He has no plan. He has no agenda beyond the one that Slaanesh provides, which is the pursuit of experience. When something draws his attention, a particular battle, a particular enemy, a particular opportunity for a dramatic entrance, he appears. When it stops being interesting, he's gone. The Emperor's children who spend their lives searching for him, hoping to bask in his presence, sometimes find him. Sometimes they don't. He still wields poison blades that can drop a Primarch. He still has 4 arms and a serpentine body that covers ground faster than almost anything in the galaxy. He still has the knowledge and tactical instinct of a great Crusade-era Primarch. 10,000 years of additional experience, and the direct favor of one of the 4 great Chaos gods. In a straight fight, he is among the most dangerous things alive. The codex from 2025 describes his presence on the battlefield as generating a visceral thrill in everyone nearby. Friend and foe alike feel something when he's close. Some electric awareness that the air has changed, that something capable of anything is nearby. This isn't a mere mechanical effect. It's a description of what it would actually be like to stand near a being who has existed at the edge of sensation for 10,000 years, and whose very essence has been rewritten by the god of excess. He can pick one of 3 different battlefield focuses each turn. The codex frames this as reflecting his capricious nature. Sometimes he's focused, sometimes he's flashy, sometimes he's specifically targeting the most challenging opponents. He doesn't commit in advance. He decides in the moment based on whatever captures his interest. That game mechanic is a better portrait of the 41st millennium Fulgrim than any prose description. He doesn't have a fixed strategy. He has whims, and his whims are more powerful than most beings' greatest efforts. His legion, the Emperor's Children, was officially released as a standalone faction in 2025, Army Box in March, full codex in April. The first Chaos Legion dedicated to a specific god to receive a full codex in this edition. It completed the set of 4 god-aligned legions, the new models, the new army rules, the new detachments. All of it reflects a faction that has spent 10,000 years without consistent leadership, becoming something specific and self-directed. The Emperor's Children don't need Fulgrim to be terrible. They've been practicing for millennia. But when he shows up, it's different. When he shows up, what they practice becomes art. What do we do with Fulgrim? How do we hold the full picture? He was the most beautiful Primarch, the most artistically gifted, the leader of the only legion ever allowed to bear the Emperor's own sigil. He was the best friend Ferrus Manus ever had. He was the Primarch who saved a dying world with sheer force of will before he was reunited with his father, and who built a legion from 200 survivors into one of the finest military organizations humanity ever produced. He was also the man who virus-bombed peaceful worlds in a fit of pique, who murdered his own officers, who killed his best friend while possessed, then chose to continue the path that possession opened, who tried to literally consume another Primarch's life force to fuel his own godhood, who poisoned Guilliman and removed one of the Imperium's most critical assets for 10,000 years, whose legion has spent those 10,000 years conducting atrocities that the word atrocity doesn't fully cover. The lore doesn't resolve this tension. It shouldn't. That tension is the point. People sometimes talk about the traitor Primarchs as a group and ask which one bears the most guilt. Horus gets most of the focus because he started everything. Magnus gets sympathy because he genuinely was trying to help when he triggered the catastrophe that led to his own fall. Angron is treated almost as a victim. The butcher's nails were never removed. He was never given a choice. He was born into torture and died into it, and anything that came after was the machinery running. Even Mortarian's story has elements of a man who just wanted to be free of something and accepted the wrong help to get there. Fulgrim's case is different. Fulgrim had clarity and chose oblivion. That's the moment that separates him. Not the killing of Ferrus, That was the demon's act at the moment of maximum possession. Not even the alliance with Horus, which the demon facilitated through months of deliberate manipulation. The moment that belongs entirely to Fulgrim is the one where he was briefly free and chose not to be. Fulgrim is what happens when a genuinely exceptional person chooses power over accountability, when they use the language of excellence and perfection to cover something that is actually just fear. Fear of inadequacy, fear of failure, fear of being the Primarch whose legion nearly died before they even started. Fear of being less than what the Emperor expected. The armor of perfectionism protected him from engaging with that fear directly. And so the fear was always there, underneath, available to any external intelligence that knew where to look. Slaanesh knew where to look. The daemon in the blade knew where to look. Horus Lupercal, who knew Fulgrim better than almost anyone, knew where to look. They all found the same door. His tragedy is that his strengths were real. The love he had for his legion, for his brothers, for the ideal of human excellence, those were genuine. The gifts Ferrus Manus made for him and received in return were genuine expressions of genuine friendship. The world of Chemos transformed from a dying twilight mine into something approaching civilization by the work of a child who understood that beauty mattered because it made survival worth surviving. That transformation was real and it cost something. The Emperor's children at their best, in the early Great Crusade before Laeran, represented something genuinely worth aspiring to. An organization that held that excellence was not incompatible with culture, that a warrior could be a craftsman and a thinker and a musician and still be among the finest soldiers in the galaxy. That the pursuit of perfection, pursued honestly and with integrity, made people better in all directions simultaneously. That was Fulgrim's real gift to humanity. He broke it. He could have been extraordinary. He was extraordinary for a while, but the same drive that made him extraordinary was the thing that broke him. The refusal to accept limitation, the need to be recognized as sufficient, the inability to sit with failure long enough to learn from it without turning the learning into a performance of improvement. These are not abstract character flaws. They are very human problems expressed at Primarch scale. They are problems that millions of ordinary people navigate daily. Most of us find ways to live with them. Fulgrim found a demon sword instead. And here is the thing I keep returning to. The thing that I think matters most. That brief moment of clarity on Isstvan V. That window when the daemon released its full grip, whether for some calculated strategic reason or simply the natural loosening of control that can follow total possession, the sources don't say, gave Fulgrim a moment of genuine selfhood, a moment of authentic experience. And in that authentic moment, the choice he made was to stop being authentic. He could have fought back then. Other accounts of demon possession suggest that resistance is possible, that the host's will can push back, that some part of the real self can maintain enough independence to refuse to call for help, to find some other way. Fulgrim didn't try. He accepted the offer. He went away. There is something worth dwelling on in that specific form of failure. Fulgrim wasn't defeated by Slaanesh in any conventional sense. He wasn't overpowered. He was offered an exit from grief and he took it. The exchange was grief for oblivion, and he judged oblivion preferable. That choice reflects everything that was wrong underneath the perfectionism. If you have never learned to sit with failure, if every shortcoming has to be immediately addressed, improved, transcended, turned into a story of recovery, then grief becomes something you cannot metabolize. The death of Ferrus, the reality of what he had done, was a failure that couldn't be improved or excised or refined away. It just was. It just had to be felt and carried. Fulgrim couldn't carry it. He gave it to the demon instead. That is the choice that defines him, not the killing of Ferrus. That was the demon, the choosing of oblivion over grief. That was Fulgrim. He is still in there, somewhere, in the four-armed serpentine entity that wanders the eye of terror and manifests capriciously across the galaxy. The codex suggests his Chaos Space Marines sense this. The way they seek him out despite his inconsistency. The way they idolize him despite his neglect. The way they interpret his random appearances as meaningful rather than arbitrary. It all suggests that something in the Emperor's children still perceives their Primarch rather than just a daemon wearing his face. Maybe they're right. Based on what the lore hints at, the Fireblade he apparently can't relinquish the way he specifically seeks acknowledgement from people who knew him before. And it's reasonable to assume some residue of the original Fulgrim persist behind the scales and the forearms and the perfumed silk and the poison blades, still carrying Fireblade, still unable to let go of the friend he killed. If so, 10,000 years of imprisonment in a body that does whatever Slaanesh wants while he watches is a worse fate than any loyalist could have arranged for him. His punishment is his reward. His perfect eternity is the most exquisite prison imaginable. That's the final irony. He sought transcendence from limitation and found the most complete cage. The phoenix burned, and it didn't rise. What came back wasn't Fulgrim. What came back was what Fulgrim always feared he was. Something that looks like excellence and is actually just hunger. Dressed up in the finest ornament the galaxy can provide. The Emperor's children look up to him still. 10,000 years of warbands pursuing sensation, noise, excess, the next experience that will feel like enough. All of them are walking the path Fulgrim walked on a much smaller scale, and none of them will find anything different at the end of it. Because the lesson of Fulgrim is not that the search for perfection leads to damnation. It's that the search for perfection as a substitute for genuine self-knowledge always does. The demon didn't give him something he didn't already want. It just gave him permission to want it without restraint. The galaxy is full of beings who have been corrupted by chaos. Almost none of them had as much to lose as Fulgrim. Almost none of them walked as far from what they could have been. That distance, from the Primarch who saved Chemos to the demon prince who walked away from the Siege of Terra because it stopped being interesting, is the measure of his tragedy, and the Fireblade he can't put down is the measure of what he knows. If you want more on the Emperor's children, the Noise Marines, the Cacophony, Lucius the Eternal, Fabius Bile's experiments across the millennia, the specific campaigns they've run against the Imperium, leave a comment below and we'll get into it. There's a lot left to explore with this legion precisely because their Primarch modeled something for them so completely and then removed himself from consistent oversight, leaving them to evolve his philosophy in directions he never intended and might not recognize. Every atrocity they commit in the 41st millennium is a descendant of choices Fulgrim made in the 31st. Every noise marine screaming into the void is a small echo of what Fulgrim screamed into on Isstvan V when he chose oblivion. And if this kind of deep character analysis is what you're here for, the questions underneath the lore, the psychology, the things the codexes gesture at but don't say directly. Subscribe, because that's what we do here. We don't just tell you what happened. We ask why it happened, and whether the people it happened to deserved what they got, and what it means for a universe that has to keep existing after people make choices like Fulgrim's. One more question before you go. Was Fulgrim ever truly redeemable? The clone says yes, that the biological template could produce a being capable of genuine remorse and genuine purpose, but the demon Primarch himself seems to say no. That 10,000 years of godhood has moved him too far from anything that could be called human to ever come back. I don't think that question has a clean answer. I think the fact that it doesn't is the whole point of his story. He pursued perfection for 200 years and found a demon sword. He pursued perfection for 10,000 years and found a serpentine body and infinite boredom. Maybe the lesson isn't about perfection at all. Maybe the lesson is about what you're willing to sacrifice to avoid sitting with who you actually are. And maybe the most perfect trap in the galaxy is one you build yourself out of the finest materials available without realizing until you're already inside it. Fulgrim built his trap out of excellence, out of the refusal to be less than what his worst fear said he was, out of a word that a dying world taught him mattered too much to ever stop reaching for. The phoenix burns. It doesn't rise. For the Emperor, sort of.